Hi everyone, I'm Shenaya and I'm currently coaching Holy Family Convent Bumble PTA and I've also debated for Holy Family Convent Bumble PTA. In this video, I will be debriefing the round 2 motion at the recently held tournament organized by Ananda College. The motion reads, this house believes that feminists should reject legal and social practices that are disproportionately favorable to women, such as presumptive custody of children during legal disputes and women and children first notion in disasters and emergencies. A few points to note before we move into argumentation, which is first of all that this is a principal motion, therefore neither of the sides are required to prove the practicality of the argumentation, but rather you are required to justify as to why you would reject these practices and on opposition as to why you would embrace it or whatever the stance you take it is. Secondly, it's also important to frame your side's problem really well and to build a very good foundation for your arguments to lie on, because down the line it might be a bit blurry as to what both sides will stand for, and it might be easy for you guys to contradict yourselves in your argumentation or in your rebuttals or analysis. So, to prevent that, it's very important to come up with very clear cut context and base your argumentation on a very unique problem to your side. With that being said, let's move on to proposition. On proposition, we debate this in the current status quo, where society right now is on a constant battle to gain equality across all aspects, be it rights, accessibility, opportunities, not only for minorities but all human beings. These practices originated in a time where patriarchy was up and going. So, stereotypes were getting in the way of anything women wish to pursue, followed by gender roles and gender biases, etc., which all further exacerbated the issues that we're going to be talking about in the debate. Thirdly, then briefly, you might want to explain what the feminist movement stands for, which is to say that the feminist movement was established as a call for action against all these inequalities happening towards women at the time and have continued to support and uplift women while breaking stereotypes one at a time. But today, the feminist movement has evolved to a point where it stands for equality for all and not just women, and will continue to uplift and support women while achieving goals one at a time. First argument, then, which is what are these practices and their implications on today's world, right? So, first of all, you would want to emphasize the fact that the impact of these legal and social practices sets the backdrop for what we do and what we don't do, and as how we view issues as a society. So, in this case, we would base it on how we set the backdrop for women to act and on what to do and what not to do, in terms of not only does it frame that, but it also frames the way how women should be treated or how women should act and whatnot, right? So examples for these practices other than the ones that are given on the topic would be, for an example, the pressure on men to pay for first dates or for most dates, or social practices such as chivalry, whereas opening doors for women, or the idea that ladies first is established. Then even things like affirmative action, which is quotas for to get women or girls into the workforce or into university. These kinds of practices have might seem uh, favorable at first glance, but it at a greater extent it harms women and the movement in the long run, because at the end of the day it correlates to something worse, which is to say that first of all it exacerbates toxic stereotypes and it further pushes these toxic stereotypical notions, right? For an example, such as these practices now establish that women are weaker, or that they need to be dependent on a man, or that women are solely responsible for a child's well-being, or even might go down to how women should be the caregiver or how women should stay at home. or how women can get their way without proper merit and etc., right? So the implications are that these practices come at the cost of society's perception of them forcing women to stay in these same traditional roles. Like, for an example, having to take care of kids, worrying about children when they're in danger, depending on a man to save them, or how even the notion that men should be the provider. All these ideas are now fueled by these practices, because in the long run it damages the progress that the feminist movement has been trying to make in breaking these stereotypical narratives, right? And you're actually going backwards and losing out on all the progress now when you sort of embrace these toxic stereotypical notions. On the next level, then it also tells young girls growing up that they need to expect such treatment, such favorable treatment, which is also harmful, because now you're going to be raising young women who are going to expect society to sort of give them this favoritism or this disproportionate treatment. The second argument then would be on the purpose of feminism. This is to say that feminism started off at a time where society was actively oppressing women, deprioritizing them and neglecting them and their needs. For an example, how it started off at a time where women were sort of forced to stay at home, look after children, they were labeled as the weaker species, they were not allowed to be drafted to the military and whatnot. Right? So this goes on to say that patriarchy was thriving at that time, hence the movement focused on women only. But today, the feminist movement has evolved along its waves of feminism, and currently, feminism is about equality for all, not just women, right? But these practices, when they are disproportionately favorable to women, can contradict that idea, that same idea, because now you are further pushing those same stereotypical sentiments, right? Because modern feminism is all about intersectionality, it's about bridging the gap and addressing the disadvantages of not only women but of men, LGBTQ people, and etc. So we should be ideally breaking these stereotypes and deviating away from them as opposed to feeding into them. The impacts of this argument are, first of all, when you contradict the very stance of the movement, you lose out on all the progress that you've been trying to make and any progress that you will make, right? Secondly, you also lose out on support by the people who do support you, because the legitimacy of the movement has only been gained through the active support that they've garnered along the years. Thirdly, then, the movement also slowly becomes unapproachable. So, all these harms directly impact the movement and the legitimacy of the movement, which will further harm any sort of progress that could be made or which undermines any progress that has been made. Thirdly, then, on a third level, the third argument would be how this further fuels patriarchy and misogyny. This is to say that these practices, as we've said before, set the stage for what society will perceive about women, right? So, when these practices continue to validate toxic stereotypes about women, for an example, the entire practice, the legal practice of providing legal custody of children by default to women, we see that this sets the precedence that, okay, look, the larger burden now falls on the woman to be the provider of these and the nurturer of these children. This looks like taking care of the children, parenting, cooking meals, bathing the children, playing with the children, but also cleaning the house and going to work and doing all those things, right? So when we sort of make it look like an obligation or something that they're supposed to do, this makes them look lesser and makes this role seem like an expectation out of women. This now impacts women by giving them no credit for the labor that they do, and it also lessens the burden that is put on the father, because now they are not required to measure up to the kinds of things that the women should, that they are supposed to do, because now the society in and of itself, as well as the legal system, expects women to be the primary caretaker of these children. Further, this also glorifies the bare minimum done by fathers or even by men, right? Because now they, whatever it is that they do will be considered as something great, because the mere fact that they decided to cook, or the mere fact that they decided to take care of the children, because they are not expected of doing that, and that might seem like something that they are taking upon by themselves. So all these notions at the end of the day uplifts patriarchy, which also contradicts what the feminist movement stands for in and of itself. On a second level, then, this also creates weaponized incompetence among men. This is to say that men can now make excuses and weaponize this same narrative to get their way. This might look like, for example, men not contributing to taking care of children at all because A, they don't have any pressure from society to do so because taking care of children are now established as a women's job. And even on a second level, even at the worst case scenario of a legal dispute, men already know that they don't have a chance at getting custody because by default it's given to a woman. So they don't necessarily have a reason to even want to learn these kinds of chores and to take care of the child basically, because they don't have an incentive or a reason to even try to do better than what they are doing today. On a third level, then, this disproportionality further leaves room for men to feel like women get the upper hand, which will fuel more hate towards women, right? Because this might look like, for an example, a woman getting something like affirmative action, and given the fact that affirmative action is only there for representation and no other reason, it might look like women are getting the easy way out of things that men might have to work twice as hard to get, right? So these kinds of notions are now going to fuel misogyny, further exacerbating the kind of oppression and the kind of hate that's already existing in society. So for opposition, then, there's a few stances that you can take as opposition. First of all, you could either fully embrace these practices or you could remain neutral and support only some and reject the others. But for the sake of the debrief, I will be basing the opposition discussion by fully embracing these uh, practices for the sake of the debrief. So, first of all, on opposition, then, what you need to set as the context is to say that women have been considered as minorities even while they are half of the population, right? Which goes on to show how much and for how long patriarchy has been dominating in the current world. Then you can also talk about how women have been oppressed for the longest time while being stripped off of basic rights, such as voting and whatnot. So, due to this, the perception of women in society has always remained unfavorable, whereas disproportionately favorable to men, and it has remained like that all along. Then we can talk about how we as the feminist movement and we are still fighting that same battle, although there's external measures that we were able to implement that were able to allow us to catch up to a certain extent. And these external measures may look like these legal and social practices that have been implemented, right? So the first argument then would be the parallel for proposition, which is the purpose of these practices. Except in this argument, you have to frame it in a certain way where you sort of address the inherent reason as to why these practices were implemented in the first place. So it's important to know the timeline, which is set during a time where women have had absolutely no place in society, right? So even taking the two examples that have been set through the motion itself, the reason that the idea of women and children first during disasters came about was because during in times of danger and emergencies, there was always a high death toll of children and especially women because they were not given the chance nor access to resources to save themselves, right? Because most often than not, it was men who got the priority when it came to life jackets or lifeboats in these historical occurrences. This goes on to show that there was an inherent need for such practices to be implemented in the first place. Even in terms of the legal dispute, the custody battle of children, during these legal disputes, it was prominent that in most cases that men or rather fathers were not competent enough to take care of their children by themselves. And as a result, these children were given to their mothers by default. Because at the end of the day, for these custody battles, what's prioritized is the child's well-being. This goes on to show that the need to as to why these practices were implemented in the first place were for the greater good, and to say that the reason as to why we think that it still needs to be implemented is because first of all, women are still considered as a minority even in today's time, right? Yes, there has been progress made, but instilled patriarchal norms have not completely disappeared just because it's 2024. Secondly, we want to address the fact that not every single woman in the picture is a privileged woman, that is to say, a rich white woman living in Beverly Hills, right? Because we see that women also fall under other minority intersections, such as women of color, women of minority race or religion, but also of the LGBTQ uh, sector as well, right? So they face far more obstacles in society when it comes to social and legal aspects, which make their lives even more difficult, which is the reason as to why and the justification as to why we still need these practices to be implemented in today's world as well. The second argument then on how these practices empower and uplift women. First of all, these legal and social practices allow women to feel a sense of security and upliftment. This is to say that it supports women further because these practices were there in times of urgency, during an emergency or during a custody battles. So, for an example, during a custody battle, we see that women are left feeling alone with no help and society pointing fingers at them and whatnot, right? So, these practices were what made them feel better and empowered them at the end of the day, right? Because for an example, having your children with you while during a custody battle, it provides them a sense of security at a time where they feel abandoned by their partners or their family and whatnot, right? These aspects helped women on a greater level in order to overcome these social and legal barricades. Secondly, then, we see that by nature, women are caregivers, right? So we think as opposition that it should not be rejected, but should be embraced rather, and allowing women to take control on aspects that they do have an upper hand on, right? Because without these practices, you would say that we as the feminist movement would be back to square one, or the progress would be very, very stagnant. These practices are what sort of push the kind of progress that the movement made so far, and rejecting these practices would only undermine that progress and delegitimize the progress that has been made through these practices and we have gained as a movement and as women. Then, thirdly, then on an economic standpoint, we see that at the end of the day, we have gained many benefits through organizations such as the UN by implementing these legal and social practices through things like mandates, through quotas, through affirmative action that has played a significant role in shaping the benefits that society now reaps. Right? These structures, these big organizations, sort of pave the way to trickle down the effect of that women are now benefiting from through these practices. So rejecting these practices would again put us back to square one, and we would be regretting all those progress that we've made so far. A third argument then would be about equalizing the playing field between the genders. This is to say that, as we mentioned before, the push that these practices gave acts as an equalizer, because after being oppressed for decades and decades and put in a disadvantage, you as a woman is now being prioritized by the system. This also acts as a measure of compensation towards women for the harms that were caused in the past, right? So continuing these practices would continue to sort of compensate the future generations to come as well. For an example, things like affirmative action, right? The reason that it was implemented was not only for representation, but also to act as a repayment or compensation for the kind of harms that were done towards women in the past and the oppression that they've gone through. So this also, on another level, puts pressure on men to be present. This would correlate to the custody example, because now men are required to measure up to that level of being present as women are currently doing, right? So for an example, if they are to fight for custody alongside each other to compete, they are required to compete alongside these practices that evens the playing field, right? Because now they will also need to be able to prove that they are as capable as society wants a woman to be. That is to say, they are required to sacrifice careers, manage a household along with a child, which evens the playing field. Without these measures that are upheld, there is no incentive for men to have to match up or to even want to try to match up, because at the point at which these practices don't exist, these benefits will not happen, right? So that's a unique benefit that side opposition garners. So on that level, you are also able to sort of get the kind of actions that side proposition is advocating for through these practices as well. uh, with this, we conclude opposition as well. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day.